Yeah, back at it. Like a good holiday habit.
Boo. So y'all already know what it is. I'm curious to know what Thomas Sowell's opinion was about the Arab slave trade in Africa. It's titled "The Bitter Truth About the Arab Slave Trade in Africa." So I'm curious to know if this is him speaking or somebody narrating from him, but it still would come from his documenting on his opinion of it. So let's
Okay,
get it.
let's see.
Although the Islamic countries of the Middle East and North Africa imported more slaves from sub-Saharan Africa than did the European offshoot nations of the Western Hemisphere, there are in these Muslim countries today no such large, discrete, and self-conscious groups of black African descent as the 60 million Negroes currently living in the Western Hemisphere. Among the reasons for this anomaly were the higher mortality rates of slaves in transit to North Africa and the Middle East, their greater vulnerability to the diseases of that region, and a very low rate of reproduction. Because the slaves were brought from long distances, often from isolated villages, they might lack biological resistance to the diseases encountered along the overland slave trade routes or at their final destinations. Although manumission was widespread in Islamic lands, the beneficiaries of this were often military slaves and others in higher occupations, where the slaves were most apt to be white rather than black. In general, black slaves were used in more menial and laborious tasks, and it was these slaves who were most likely to live and die as slaves, with their children being born into slavery.
Yep.
They had few children, however, for both marriage and casual sex among slaves was suppressed. Moreover, the death rate among those few children was so high that they rarely lived to adulthood.
Ooh.
Wow.
The widespread use of eunuchs in the harems of the Islamic countries further reduced the ability of the African slave population to reproduce itself. In the 10th century, the court of the Caliph of Baghdad reportedly included 7,000 black eunuchs and 4,000 white eunuchs. With the passing centuries, as European nations grew militarily stronger and became better able to resist the Islamic nations, European slaves became scarcer in the Islamic lands to which they had once been sent in great numbers. Their importation was drastically reduced in the early decades of the 19th century, when Tsarist Russia conquered the Caucasus, from which European slaves were being shipped to the Ottoman Empire.
Okay.
However, as late as the 1850s, orders against the traffic in white slaves from Russian-controlled Georgia and Circassia were being issued by the Ottoman government. By the end of the 19th century, white slaves had virtually disappeared, except in Arabia, while black slavery was not abolished in most Islamic countries until the period between the two world wars of the 20th century, and still existed in Mauritania and the Sudan at the end of the 20th century.
Wow.
The horrors of the Atlantic voyage in packed and suffocating slave ships.
So the last video that we did about it didn't mention that.
Didn't get that depth. That's some depth.
Yeah.
That's some key information.
So there were white slaves, and then they were told to stop getting
The
and
white
using-
slave.
Yeah.
Yep.
Wow, that was the change in.
They said no more white slaves. Stop.
And we're
what-
only going to use the black slave, but that was based off of the Ottoman Empire and what Russia and all them were doing. So they went ahead and put something like a document and whatever out to say, no, halt, seize.
Nope.
We're not doing that.
Nope.
But we're going to use them, and we're going to use them on them to the 20th century.
Nope.
Wow.
Yep.
That's crazy.
Together with exposure to new diseases from Europeans and other African tribes, as well as the general dangers of the Atlantic crossing in that era, took a toll in lives amounting to about 10% of all slaves shipped to the Western Hemisphere in British vessels in the 18th century, the British being the leading slave traders of that era. However, the death toll among slaves imported by the Islamic countries, many of these slaves being forced to walk across the vast burning sands of the Sahara, was twice as high.
Yo.
Thousands of human skeletons were strewn along one Saharan slave route alone, mostly the skeletons of young women and girls. These skeletons tended to cluster in the vicinity of wells, suggesting the last desperate efforts to reach water.
Yo.
Slaves who could not keep up with the caravans, often because their feet had swollen from walking across the hot sands, were abandoned in the desert to die a lingering death from heat, thirst, and hunger.
Oh, my God.
In 1849, a letter from an Ottoman official referred to 1,600 black slaves dying of thirst on their way to Libya.
That's sad.
On another route, it was said that someone unfamiliar with the desert might almost be able to find his way just by following the trail of skeletons of people and camels.
Oh,
Yeah.
Widespread loss of life began with the initial slave raids. As late as 1886, an Austrian who was an apologist for slavery nevertheless reported, "Negro villages are burned, all the men killed, and their women and children are taken on months-long, terrible marches." The march from slave-gathering areas, like the region around Lake Chad, across the Sahara Desert to the Mediterranean Sea, took about 3 months, and often only the strongest survived.
3 months?
How many slaves made it?
Barefoot?
How many made it?
Oh my gosh, that is just unheard of. And I was sitting here wondering, like, they didn't have no type of nothing for their feet?
I'm thinking about the hot concrete on a summer day.
That
You know how
is-
sand gets scolding?
No. Yes, you can't even walk on it.
Can't-
There's
you can't.
absolutely no way.
There's no way.
Oh, man, that's horrible.
Imagine the whole way. Ha. Yo.
Until you can't do it anymore.
So what happened? What was the difference between the feet of some people and the feet of other people that couldn't make it? But he said mostly it was the women that didn't make it.
And then, I don't know. I was going to say the will.
You wouldn't make it with them feet. My feet would be strong.
Other slave routes to Islamic countries were over water, but this meant risking interception by the British Navy, and that in turn often meant that slaves were thrown overboard to drown, rather than being allowed to remain on board to be discovered as incriminating evidence.
Oh.
The trans-Saharan caravan route was the most deadly, however. It has been estimated that, for every slave to reach Cairo alive, 10 died on the way. Nor was Cairo exceptional. Missionary explorer David Livingstone, among others, estimated that several slaves were captured for every one that reached the Mediterranean alive.
Oh my God, your
Women
numbers were so tough. It was either you died or you were captured, and the last were made it across. But my God, you having to see everybody just how many people? How many per 10 people? How many per people just would not be with you when you get to the end?
I mean, look to the left or look to the right. One of them is not
gonna be here.
And maybe both. I mean, but at least one person you're not going to see.
Right.
That's crazy.
were particularly vulnerable and were more in demand than men. They brought higher prices in the Islamic countries, where they were widely used as domestic servants or as concubines. Ethiopian women sold for higher prices than Negro women, and white women from the Caucasus brought the highest prices of all.
Wow.
A special danger to men and boys was castration, to produce the eunuchs widely used in Islamic countries for work in the harems. Because the operation was forbidden under Islamic law, it was usually performed early, and often crudely, before reaching areas under the effective control of the Ottoman Empire.
Ooh.
An estimated
So illegally, they were detaching the testicles
Yep,
against the Islamic law, and trying to do it and before anyone they were caught, pretty much.
90% of the men or boys died from the operation, though some groups of slave traders were sufficiently skilled to have much lower mortality rates. Eunuchs brought far higher prices than other slaves.
Why?
Dead and dying slaves were a common sight in the wake of a slave caravan. David Livingstone said that the common incidents of the slave trade that he had seen were so nauseous that I always strive to drive them from memory. For example, one woman, who was unable to carry both her load and young child, had the child taken from her and saw its brains dashed out on a stone. It was not only the Christian missionary Livingstone who was shocked by the brutality of Arab slave raiders and traders, so was Muhammad Ali, the ruler of Egypt, who was a battle-hardened military commander. The prime destination of the African slave trade to the Islamic world was Istanbul, capital of the Ottoman Empire, where the largest and busiest slave market flourished. There, women were paraded, examined, questioned, and bid on in a public display, often witnessed by visiting foreigners, until it was finally closed down in 1847 and the slave trade in Istanbul moved underground. In other Islamic countries, however, the slave markets remained open and public, both to natives and foreigners. In 1868, a British captain witnessed the scene at a slave market in Zanzibar. Rows of girls from the age of 12 and upwards are exposed to the examination of throngs of Arab slave dealers and subjected to inexpressible indignities by the brutal dealers. This market functioned until 1873, when 2 British cruisers appeared offshore, followed by an ultimatum from Britain that the Zanzibar slave trade must cease or the island would face a full naval blockade. This was part of a wider crackdown on the seaborne slave trade in 1873, which caused the trade to become localized rather than to disappear entirely. The treatment of slaves in transit by slave traders often differed from the treatment of slaves at their destinations, but this varied according to both the geographical destinations and the occupational destinations of the slaves. A domestic slave in Istanbul might receive much milder treatment than a plantation slave in East Africa. Although slaves in the Islamic world performed a wide variety of work, pearl divers in the Persian Gulf, seamen in the Indian Ocean and Red Sea, agricultural laborers in Ethiopia or Zanzibar, domestic service was much more common in the Islamic world than in the Western Hemisphere, and plantation labor was much rarer. Wealthier men in the Ottoman Empire often had harems with hundreds of women and substantial numbers of eunuchs to work there.
Wow.
In the Sultan's palaces, black eunuchs worked in the women's quarters, while white eunuchs worked in his court.
Wow.
Both sets of eunuchs included leaders.
Because I guess they're like, you could oversee, have full maximum power, and have no sexual desire or mess with any of these women.
I don't know. It just goes back. I'm just thinking, like, just fact checking him against the other video that we listened to, and he has some of the same information that the other person was saying. So I'm like, okay, so it's truth.
Who achieved a certain prosperity and influence, or even wealth and power, but of course they perpetuated neither their race nor their culture. Eunuchs were sometimes trusted with high military or civilian posts, on grounds that they had no incentive to try to establish a rival dynasty, nor were they likely to be corrupted from their duties by the seductions of women. While the treatment of slaves by their ultimate purchasers, as distinguished from the slave traders who brought them to market, has been considered generally milder in the Islamic world than in the Western Hemisphere plantation societies, the evidence is much sketchier, for there was no organized anti-slavery movement in the Muslim countries, as there was in Britain, the United States, and elsewhere in Western civilization, to serve as a source of information on abuses of slaves. There was no market in these countries for literature, such as the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, or for the autobiographies of Frederick Douglass and other former slaves. There was in general very little writing about slavery in the Islamic world, where slavery was simply not an issue. Plantation slavery in the Western Hemisphere was not surrounded by walls, and so could be observed by outsiders, many of them critical of the institution of slavery itself and alive to its abuses. What happened behind the walls of Ottoman Empire homes and palaces is much less known. Still less can anyone know today what was in the minds and hearts of those slaves, how they felt about being a degraded people in a foreign land, how a eunuch felt about being deprived of a normal family life, how a concubine felt about being made available without regard to her own feelings, to her owners, or to whomever her owner might give, lend, or sell her. What is known is that there was an extremely low reproduction rate among the Africans enslaved in the Muslim countries. Black women who had children sired by slave owners were sometimes freed, but the magnitude and effect of this phenomenon were not such as to leave a major black population in the region. The story of the African diaspora today is thus largely the story of the descendants of Africans in the Western Hemisphere.
Okay.
Wow. Yeah.
He filled in a lot of information, things that were said.
Well, he has a lot that goes along with the other video that we did. A lot of it was,
in the details.
much of it. Yeah, he did hit some points that weren't mentioned, but he did, substantiate some of the points in the other video that we watched. So I was like, okay, so
okay. I always know,
true.
and I always know when I can go to Thomas Sowell as a source, and I fully trust the source. I trust the source. Like if you read in Google Scholar,
right? And based off what the person he was saying at the end, the person Thomas Sowell was saying at the end, no, I mean, you could just look at their faces and tell that they weren't happy about that. That was a horrible, disastrous,
Yep.
unexplainable tragedy. It really was. It really was. See, that man is, crying there. Of course, it's like, just unbelievable.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead. You got anything?
This was good. I mean, this was good. He just substantiates and giving us more light as to how the slave trade really was over in Istanbul. I understand now a little bit more about the Ottoman Empire and how the Romans played a part, and how Europeans were actually slaves. There were white people who were slaves.
And then they were like, nope, no more white slaves. Use the black ones. All right. Like, comment, subscribe. Don't take a nosedive, but comment down in the section below if you want some more.